I should probably begin this morning by making a little announcement, sort of a disclaimer. The message this morning is going to be unusual. Out of the ordinary would be a better way to phrase it, from the normal fare we have from week to week on Sabbath. I have been impressed to speak upon the subject of both country living and the cities, and more specifically, when to leave the cities. And I hope you'll be praying with me as I proceed. And it may seem strange to you that Christians would talk about when to leave the cities. You may be wondering, are we supposed to leave the cities? Where does that come from? Well, I thought it'd be appropriate to start with a fable from Aesop. Would that be okay? How many of you have heard the story of the city mouse and the country mouse, or different variations of this story? As the fable goes, the city mouse goes to visit his cousin who lives in the country. And he shakes his head and says, "What a shame. Here you are living in this grass hut, and you're just eating seeds, while back in the city, I feast like a king. I eat cheese and bread and cake." And as his city cousin was preparing to leave, the country mouse started looking around. He had felt content until his cousin made him discontent. He said, "Well, I'm going to come back and find out what it's like to feast that way." So he went with his city mouse cousin back to the city, and he said, "Well, to start with, how'd you like some cake?" He said, "That sounds good, even though I don't know what cake is yet." So they went out on the counter, and there was a cake just sitting there, much more than they could ever eat. And so they just nibbled, and he had never tasted anything so good until he heard his city cousin shout, "Run!" And he could see from the panic on his face he better follow. And it looked like the cook evidently was coming in and had picked up a knife. And so they ran for cover, and after they went through a hole in the wall, they were huffing and puffing. He said, "Don't worry about this." He said, "I know where there's some good cheese." And so they went and they found a cupboard, and in the cupboard was a cheese all unwrapped, and the country mouse had never tasted anything so aromatic. And while they were eating the cheese, pretty soon they heard, "Meow." And the city mouse said, "Run!" And they both ran for their lives, huffing and puffing, and they were inside a nook by the wall there, and he thought, "Boy, this is not good for my heart." The country mouse was beginning to fret a little bit, but he said, "Well, look, there's some more cheese." And he started to go over and take a piece of cheese that was sitting on this contraption, and his city cousin said, "Don't touch that." He said, "If you eat that cheese, you're dead." It was a mouse trap. And so pretty soon he said, "I think I'm heading home, because I'm not sure that the city life is for me." And I think the proverb that Aesop came up with at the end of the story is, "I'll take my humble crumbs and seed in comfort over all of your finery with fear." In the message today, I am going to try to do my best to strike a balance with where should Christians try to live? How should we place ourselves in the light of the Bible and inspired counsel? And I'm also going to weave in my own personal experience, and we're all influenced by that a little bit, and it'll help you gain some perspective. If nothing else, you'll better understand why Pastor Doug and Karen are where we are. And I'm going to open up and get a little bit personal with you today about some of these things and these struggles. Perhaps I should begin by reminding you that I was not raised in the country. I guess you could say I'm a city mouse. I was born in Burbank, California, but by the time I was 6 years old, I was living in New York City. And so I grew up in Manhattan. For a while, we lived in L.A., and my dad moved to Miami, lived in Miami, Miami Beach, and went to school in a number of different places. And I became discontent with the cities because the few times I'd go off to summer camp, I was in awe. The country just seemed to call me. And the mountains, and there was something about it I found just absolutely hypnotic, and I couldn't wait to get out. I guess I was looking for something real, and the city, you're surrounded by the things made by man, and it was so artificial. And so I made up my mind. I said, I want to find out what's real, and nature to me was real, and so I ran away to the mountains. First time I ran away to the mountains, I was 13 years old. But I lived up there in the hills for about a day or two. And I was so lonely because it was just me in a tent, 13 years old up in the hills. I thought, I made it, I'm here. And then I thought, now what? You can only cook and eat so much. And I became very lonely, and so I went back home with my tail between my legs. I thought, next time I go, I'm going to have a friend with me. And so I finally ran away again at 15. I lost my friend somewhere along the way. He got arrested or something. And I ended up going to the mountains in Southern California, and I moved up into a cave way back in these desert mountains. And I'll tell you, it was real country living. I was a hermit, and I liked it. At this time, I was a little older, and I had grown accustomed to being alone, and I would go days without seeing anybody. And I find that even people who are involved in country living, I've met very few people that have gone 5 or 6 days, no telephone, no radio, no newspaper, no human voice, just you're by yourself. And it's a very interesting experience if you've never done that. I'm not recommending it, but it's something you don't forget. Well, as I was living up there, I finally found a Bible. I accepted the Lord. I'm making a long story short. I was pretty much an atheist, and I was looking for religion. I thought I'd find God in nature. So I really loved country living because it was a God for me for a little while. When I read in the Bible, there was a verse in Isaiah 5:8 that really resonated with me. And it says, "Woe unto them who join house to house, and they add field to field, till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land." And so I was yearning for this. But while I was living up there in the cave, and after I accepted the Lord, the Holy Spirit began to impress me. You can't just stay here and do nothing. I was so excited about the truth, I knew that God wanted me to share it. And I realized that the more I shared Christ, the more I was able to keep, the more I learned, the more real it was. When I just said, I'm glad I'm saved, too bad for all of those poor sardines living in the city, something was wrong with my spirit. And I was reading the story about Elijah in the cave in the wilderness when he fled. And when I got to the part where God said to Elijah, "What doest thou here?" I mean, I was up in a cave really hiding out. And here God had given me this truth, and I was so excited about it, but I was just very much putting my light under a bush. And God said, you need to share it with people. So now I went to the other extreme. I moved into the city. And I had a job, and this is a picture of when I had a little steak business, and that was the apartment. Lived in the city, and somebody gave me a book called Country Living. And I've got a copy of that here. It printed in 1946, and I started to read in that book some very important statements that I believed were true. And for instance, Country Living, page 32, where it says, out of the cities, this is the message the Lord has been giving me. The earthquakes will come, the floods will come, and we are not to establish ourselves in the wicked cities where the enemy is served in every way and where God is so often forgotten. And then I wrote another statement here, and this is from Testimonies, Volume 7. It's also in Country Living. The ungodly cities of our world are to be swept away by the besom of destruction. In the calamities that are now befalling immense buildings and large portions of the city, God is showing us what will come upon the whole earth. And so then I said, all right, I'm out of here. Got on the road, started hitchhiking, and I got picked up in Ukiah, and this couple said they were going to Kobolo. And I said, well, what's there? Oh, they said, there's nothing out there. They don't even have a theater in town. It's just surrounded by wilderness. I said, oh, that sounds good. I said, are there any caves? They said there were no redwoods. I said, well, are there any caves? I said, well, probably in the Black Butte River. And so went to Kobolo, moved into a cave. Eventually, I couldn't just stay in the cave and do nothing. Got a job down in town. Worked for the forestry. It was great. I was thinning trees up in the forest. But they said you need an address. And it's a long story, but God worked out a miracle where I was able to get a piece of land in the hills, started buying it with a partner up there. We went into the firewood business. He took off. I've never heard from him since, and I ended up with the property. And it turned out to be a real blessing over time because we've still had that land ever since. And that is the first house I built, and that's what you call country living. I was 18, 19 years old when I first built that, and that was an upgrade. It was living in a tent when we first moved up there. And yes, we had goats. We'd milk them right there in the house. They'd jump in. And then I've got another picture. I actually improved the house. Here's the upgrade on the house. By the way, I built this with a chainsaw, the only power tools I had. You'd be surprised how much you could do. And on the inside there were rafters. Lived up there 6 years, sold firewood, did odd jobs, mechanic work, but it was country living. It was a beautiful place, beautiful view, gravity flow water, still have the same property up there. But then I began to get the call to the ministry. Right after that, God began to open doors in town for me to preach in other churches. But began to travel around and was preaching around the country in Texas and did mission work in New Mexico. And while we were away from the home, the shack up there, some other country living people moved into our cabin while we were gone, started growing pot on our property. And we finally went back. Karen and I burned that house down back. We were paying taxes on that shack. Can you believe that? So we burnt that down because people kept moving into it, and it was real dilapidated. And then designed a much nicer home that we thought would last. And this is a picture, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, that's our house now in Koval. It's about 20 years old. Designed it, built it. It's completely off the grid. Solar electric. There's a closer picture here, and you can see the solar panels up on the roof. And I understand water power, solar power, wood power. We use wood power to heat the hot water in the wintertime. There aren't too many pastors out there that understand country living much better than Pastor Doug. I'm sure there are some, not too many. Let me just tell you right now, I speak fluent country living. This is way out in the hills, and this is been 30 years since we first got the property up there.